Most of the time when we look at old games companies, we're entirely talking about them in the past tense, because they aren't around anymore and haven't been for years. Really, the only time that wasn't the case perhaps was when we looked at Team 17. However, today we have another company to add to that list, a company that can actually trace their origins all the way back to the very beginning of the UK microcomputer boom in the early 1980s, and are still going strong today. They're still here, and they're still independent almost 40 years later. They are, of course, System-3, an independent publisher that, through a fair share of ups and downs, a bit of bravado and, of course, some classic games along the way, have tried to maintain a pretty high standard of quality. That's always been the case since 1982, and today, they still do that. So, it's time to have a look at one of the British scene's great survivors. This is the story, and the games, of the almighty System-3. It's quite a lengthy history, and so we're going to have to do it in two parts. In this first part we'll cover the 1980s and their glittering portfolio on the 8-bit machines, particularly the Commodore 64. The name of System-3 is generally wrapped up with one man and one man alone, a Londoner by the name of Mark Cale. Throughout the company's history they've generally existed as a publisher, hiring people on a freelance basis. And while a lot of brilliant talent has certainly passed through the company over the years, only a few names such as Tim Best, Hugh Riley and John Twiddy have taken up significantly long residencies, on and off, leaving Mark as the company's only constant over its 35+ year existence. How did he get started? Well, he kind of got started through being a bit of an annoying whinger. Let me explain. As a youngster, one of Mark's passions was, and indeed still remains, photography. After school he started working for the famous Norman Parkinson and learnt plenty more about his passion, something that he's kept going ever since. But in his words for Retro Gamer when interviewed by David Crooks, at the time he kind of figured that there wasn't going to be a whole lot of money in a career doing photography. And so he started thinking about other things that he could do, which in a roundabout way led to something else he rather enjoyed. Games. He had a regular gig at the time taking photos for Atari UK, and while he was there he tended to moan a lot about the quality of the games being released for the VCS, saying that they weren't good enough. We don't know whether it was out of encouragement or, more likely, out of sheer annoyance, but a man by the name of John Norledge, Atari UK's development manager, said to Mark that if he wanted games that met with his seal of approval, he should go and set up his own publishing house. A light bulb went off in his head, and with the help of two friends, Emerson Best and Michael Koo, the 18-year-old Mark set up System-3 out of his bedroom in 1982. The name was born out of the course they were on, which was called System Studies, and there being 3 of them. System-3 very quickly became System-2, as Michael left to concentrate on his studies, leaving Mark and Emerson to put out the company's first games, Colony 7 for the Atari 8-bits, Laser Cycle for the BBC Micro, and Death Star Interceptor for the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum. None of these titles are particularly well known these days, but they did the job, making the fledgling publisher enough money so that they could keep going towards the next title. Of the 3 titles there's no doubt which one was the most important. System-3 never ended up doing too much on the Atari 8-bits or the BBC Micro, but Death Star Interceptor was the first title released on the computer that they would make their name on. There's no real doubt about it. When you think of System-3, you think of games made for the C64. This game was the beginning of a beautiful relationship. The game itself, as you might have guessed from the name, is very much inspired by a certain story that's set in a galaxy far, far away. It's a space shooter with 3 different scenes, one that takes place outside of the Death Star, a quickie taking off scene at the beginning, and another that naturally takes place in the Death Star's trench, with the aim naturally being to get to the end, hit that exhaust port, and blow the whole thing up in as spectacular a style as these old systems can manage. The Speccy version, which is commonly regarded as the best version, is even more blatant about its inspiration. Your ship actually fights both TIE fighters and X-Wings, which suggests a dark scenario where the Rebels and the Empire have actually gotten together. And when you blow the Death Star up, guess what music you hear? As I've often said, this was a time, 1984, when such blatant rip-offs were likely to fly under the radar and not result in lawsuits. However, things were changed a little on the Commodore. Here the blatant takes from Star Wars have been replaced by, well, generic chemical compound ships. I imagine that the reason for this was that, being a Commodore 64 game, and not exactly a bad selling one, Mark Cale wanted to try and sell the game in the C64's country of origin, the USA. And so, even if the C64 version of this game may well have had TIE fighters and the like at one point, they ended up being removed. Mark's trip to the USA ended up being a very productive one where he met with several big US names, chiefly Epics and Electronic Arts, with the view to setting up a working relationship. Talks with these two companies fell through, but System-3 did manage to find an inroad with Activision, who were looking to establish themselves in the UK software market. Mark met up with Activision at the perfect time. They'd just entered into partnership with Electric Dreams Software to release Activision games in the UK. And so, System-3 set up a partnership of their own to get their games in the US for Activision, with Rod Cousins of Electric Dreams acting as a sort of intermediary. Mark also came back with a couple of goodies from talks with the US publisher Tronix. He brought back a couple of their Commodore 64 games, Suicide Strike, Deuce and Motocross, and he did a deal to market and sell them in the UK. Taking games from foreign lands and distributing them wouldn't be a path that System-3 would go back down again for quite a while, but they were amongst the first to do it in Europe, if not the first full stop, possibly beating US Gold, who obviously became a lot more famous for doing it, to the punch by a couple of months or so. Having gotten into the computer business by way of a beleaguered employee's sharp retort to a young and mouthy photographer, System-3 had made a pretty okay start to their business. You might say that in getting in to have meetings with the likes of EA and Activision, despite only having a handful of pretty small titles on the shelves, they'd been punching well above their weight. However, they did need a bit more, something to take them to the next level if the story was going to go beyond a few not bad games published out of a bedroom. Fast talk and good timing had got them in with Activision, and there was certainly a commitment to making quality software. As their mission statement said, perfection was the only acceptable standard. But such words naturally need to be backed up with classics. It was around this time that System-2 became System-1. Mark Cale's friend Emerson Best leaves the picture, leaving Mark to run the company alone. However, Emerson did provide the inspiration before he left for the company's first really, and I do mean really, big hit. When he wasn't co-running System-3 with Mark, Emerson's main passion was as a keen practitioner of Taekwondo. In fact, he was quite good at it. He'd competed for the national British team. This love of martial arts, naturally, led to the inspiration for a fighting game which Emerson and Mark agreed to call International Karate. And then, as mentioned, Emerson left soon after. Mark looked for a developer to create this game, and found one in Basildon by the name of LT Software. Now, is that name familiar to you? It may well be if you watched the earlier documentary that I made on Sensible Software. LT were a short-lived and, in the grand scheme of things, quite minor developer, credited on few games but crucial in the development of a couple of younger folk who were associated with them, particularly the two men who'd go on to create Sensible Software, John Hare and Chris Yates. And someone else too, who we'll mention shortly. Anyway, System-3 chose to work with LT, commissioning International Karate and also eventually taken up the first Sensible Software game, which was then called Mother of Harlots. The decision was, well, it really wasn't a good one. LT were quite the chaotic company, as it turned out, and the person who later signed the job of creating International Karate 2? Well, he was apparently kind of eccentric. Perhaps a bit too fond of various herbal and chemical remedies, so we'll say. His identity pretty much remains unknown, and one day, well, the guy just left. He upped sticks, walked out of the office one day and buggered off, never to be seen again, leaving LT with a thoroughly unfinished game, albeit one with some okay enough artwork provided by John Hare, and a deadline that naturally had to be met. Enter a young man who'd just finished up on his first game, a kind of Defender-esque but very playable indeed shooter for a couple of micros by the name of Drop Zone. Enter Archer McLean. With Archer McLean on board, International Karate as a project starts to get back on track. However, there is plenty of pressure. We're in the third quarter of 1985 now, the name of International Karate is starting to get bandied around in magazines, and we are heading towards one of the biggest dates in the British computing calendar, the annual PCW show. This show, won by Personal Computer World, which was then the oldest and indeed first British computing magazine, was the biggest of the year, with companies the world over come into play. Big enough to be reported on by the computer-based TV shows like, say, Database. Big enough for all the big cheeses to come and play, the likes of Alan Sugar with the latest weapons from Amstrad's assault on the market, and Jack Tramiel, there to promote the all-new Atari ST. System-3 were also there with a stand and, well, they didn't have a whole lot to show. Mother of Harlots was on display, but International Karate, the major title, was still in the shed. And yet if System-3 were to survive, they needed to make an impact right here, right now. And so, they went all in anyway. Hell, Mark even persuaded his mother to remortgage the house. It was PCW or bust. How did they do it? Well, they chose to disrupt. Young and bolshy, they went all out on their stand with scantily clad dancers and karate exhibitions. Lots of blocks of wood were put to the sword, or rather the karate chop, with the aim of promoting international karate, and lots of thoroughly made up dancers were going about their thing with plenty of play violence and whips in the service of Mother of Harlots. The slogan was, naughty, but nice. Mark was pretty sure that such a display would piss off the quite conservative and Christian-minded organisers of the PCW show, and indeed it did. The System-3 stand was under siege with organisers threatening to turn the power off to System-3 stand if this beastly unpleasantness continued. Mark held out for as long as possible, insisting that it was only entertainment for the kids, before finally agreeing to remove the dancing girls, although the karate exhibitions remained. The girls might have been a bit relieved about it. They were working barefoot, and all the splinters on the floor from endless blocks of wood getting chopped in half wasn't exactly making for prime working conditions. Needless to say, System-3 were not exactly welcomed back to the PCW show in the future. They pretty much became the first company to be banned from the expo. But it didn't really matter to them, because they had gotten what they'd wanted. They'd held out long enough to ensure that their raunchy exhibition had been snapped plenty of times by the photographers from Fleet Street, which guaranteed them tons of attention. Not just from tabloids, but from computer game mags like Crash, whose own reports from the expo were chock full of pictures from System-3's display. They were loud, proud, and most definitely controversial, but they'd got people's attention. Still, it would all have been nothing more than a flash in the pan if the games that System-3 were promoting didn't deliver. Mother of Harlots, eventually rechristened Twister Mother of Charlotte, is a pretty good game, a fine title with multiple scenes and rather cool graphics, but in the end it wasn't a big seller, and a proposed C64 version of the title was cancelled. John Hare and Chris Yates had no trouble working with System-3, but somewhat annoyed at the lack of money they received from LT, who took the lion's portion of System-3's commission, they went off to do their own thing, and the rest is history. However, it would be International Karate, the game with the absolutely disastrous development cycle, that would become System-3's first massive hit, and stone cold classic. Archer McLean took what was there and rebuilt it into a masterpiece. Well, on the C64 at least, let's just not talk about the ZX Spectrum version. International Karate on the Commodore 64 is a pretty good contender for being one of the best, if not the best fighting game released in those heady days before the onset of games like Street Fighter 2. It's quite a simple game. One button and or a direction controls your movement and your attack. Knockdowns score either a half point or a full point depending on the cleanliness of the strike, and 2 points win the fight. There's bonus games on offer, including naturally a spot of head-on-wood violence, and you keep fighting others in order to get more belts until, if you're really good, you finally obtain the black belt and become a master. The whole thing just continues until, eventually, you lose. Playing International Karate is just relaxing. so efficient and so much fun, it's more than held up today. The top-notch music provided by the almighty Rob Hubbard only seals the deal even further. It's one of the Commodore's best games. As a fighting game from this era, there are few games that can match or beat it. One of them is, of course, the sequel, which we'll get to eventually. Another one, perhaps, is the Melbourne House game Way of the Exploding Fist, which had come out a few months earlier, a game that International Karate is very similar to, and one that Archer McLean, interviewed for Retro Gamer, acknowledges as an inspiration. He played Exploding Fist to death. International Karate is like another take on Exploding Fist, certainly visually, although there are differences in how they play, with Fist being a bit slower. Still, they're similar to the point where you might wonder if Melbourne House ever complained about it legally. But, as far as I can tell, no, they didn't. Indeed, both games seem to mutually benefit each other, with later Fist games and upgrades taking cues from International Karate and its sequels. As we'll see soon though, another company didn't quite see it the same way. With International Karate, System-3 were able to back up their loud and controversial PCW show display by releasing a smash of a game. A big, critically adored hit. Mind you, there were some who didn't much like it. Chiefly, Activision. The PCW show controversy hadn't spoiled System-3's relationship with the Americans, who agreed to publish Twister in the US, but they didn't care for International Karate. No less a figure than Scott Orr, founder of the sports label GameStar and the man who would eventually be the lead designer for the John Madden football series, absolutely rubbished the game, calling it typical European trash and saying that it would never work in America. Unfazed, Mark Cale promptly sold International Karate to Epix, who redubbed the game World Karate Championship and sold it to the States, where it went straight to the top of the charts. Activision had got it wrong, and their failure to recognise the hit potential of International Karate convinced them that this young British upstart with all the fast talk actually knew what he was doing. However, this was not quite the end of the original International Karate story. The release of World Karate Championship garnered the attention of Data East USA, and the American win of the Japanese company promptly sued Epix over similarities to their 1984 arcade game Karate Champ. In their eyes, Epix had infringed on their copyright. The case would roll on for a couple of years. The initial outcome from a district court in 1987 was that Epix had infringed on copyright due to the visual similarities between both games, with the result being that all unsold copies of the game had to be recalled. However, Epix appealed the decision, and ultimately, in November 1988, an appeals court decided that International Karate had not infringed on Data East's copyright. There were no substantial similarities. While there were similarities between the two games, these were similarities that encompass the idea of karate and would therefore be present in all karate video games. In simpler terms, Data East could not copyright the idea of a karate game. This judgment actually turned out to be quite important, as it was one of the first of its kind. Ironically enough, the result of this exact judgment would help out Data East years later, when Capcom sued them for breach of copyright over the game Fighter's history and its similarity to Street Fighter II. Capcom lost the case because, again, they could not hold copyright over the idea of a fighting game and the various expressions of those ideas that would naturally be similar over basically all fighting games. We've gotten a little off of the subject of System-3, but it's fun to note how important this title was in many areas, even outside of the world of gaming. That Data East vs Epix judgment has been used a lot in the ensuing years. A suit that Microsoft launched against Apple over the similarities between their respective OS's GUIs was defeated, with the Data East Epix case being used as a major citation. Isn't legal history fun? Anyway, as far as the main story goes, System-3 had their first really big hit of a game. They would remain in the world of martial arts for their next one, which wasn't too far away. In 1987 they used martial arts in a wholly different way, not just to have two people beating each other up in the name of competition, but to tell something that was more of a story. In other words, they made an action-adventure, and the finished product would turn out to be a platform-defining title for the Commodore 64. The original idea for what would eventually become The Last Ninja was Mark Cale's, and he had it in 1985, although his desire to create an action-adventure game went back even further than that. In fact, pretty much back to the very first action-adventure game, Adventure on the Atari 2600. However, it was 1985 when the proper idea would be formulated. An isometric adventure game on the C64, starring a ninja, and filled with action and puzzles. As was the case with most System-3 games, the title would have to try and push boundaries, and being an isometric game with high-res graphics, The Last Ninja was certainly going to be doing that. In a time when most games were done and dusted in a couple of months or so of development, the development of The Last Ninja, from original idea to eventual release, took 2 whole years. How did the game take so long? Well, there were various reasons. Initially, the idea of the game caused quite a bit of tension in the halls of System-3 itself, with a fair few of the company's programmers believing that the game simply couldn't be done and thus leaving as a result. Mark Cale was pretty damn obstinate when it came to pushing this title through. Still, people would remain who would play an important part in the development of the game, and indeed the series as a whole, such as the eventual producer and designer, the late Tim Best. Despite that, several development teams were broken on the back of The Last Ninja. They were working with concept art and graphics that were supplied by Bob Stevenson and Hugh Riley respectively, but they were unable to get to grips with what Mark Cale wanted. It was a tall order. The most famous of these attempts came from a Hungarian company called Softview, which was basically a subsidiary of Robert Stein's Andromeda, a name you may know either from the big hit Caesar the Cat, or more likely from their supporting role in the famous battle for the rights to Tetris. Stein and Andromeda worked sort of as intermediaries between the West and the programmers that were working behind the Iron Curtain, and their star was pretty bright around this time. However, after a year's worth of work, Softview had still not been able to wrestle The Last Ninja into a workable game, and their involvement in the project ended. The story behind the Hungarians' attempt at the game has changed a bit over the years. One story that spread earlier on was that Softview's attempt at The Last Ninja was, in fact, nearly done before System-3 took it back, kicked them off the project, and then added the finishing touches before releasing it. Sneaky, if true, but the story has since been proven to be false. The actual story, simply, was that the Hungarian team lacked the technical know-how to pull the game off. They were apparently working in the 4th programming language, which was hardly fit for purpose. It made everything really slow. Mark and Hugh Riley took 3 trips to Budapest over the course of the Hungarian team's time with the game, and they found it to be far from finished. Most of Hugh's sprites weren't even animated, let alone fighting with each other. Eventually they took the program back, with Robert Stein duly refunding all advances that System-3 had paid to them. The Hungarian development wasn't totally fruitless. One member of the team, István Bodnari, created a level editor called Integrator that would eventually prove crucial to the game's creation. But the key piece of Last Ninja's puzzle was finally put in place when Mark contacted a hotshot young coder by the name of John Twiddy to take what had already been done, rewrite the code, get the levels created, sprites animated, and finally bring this title to life. He refined the Integrator editor to use half the memory, he innovated when it came to getting the C64 to display as many high-res objects as it did with the game, and he successfully worked around various limitations. The process took about 2 to 3 months, and it was as intense as all hell. John Twiddy worked pretty much all the hours in the day on The Last Ninja, mostly at Mark Cale's apartment with the man himself watching over his shoulders. This was a brutal death march of a push to finally bring the game to fruition, and by John Twiddy's estimation there was probably 1 single byte of memory left over by the time the game was actually finished. People have often bemoaned the fact that The Last Ninja, after providing such an epic adventure for the time, finishes with a lousy single screen, mostly text-based ending. And that was the reason. There simply wasn't enough room for anything else. Finally then, the game was done and dusted. Soon enough, it was out. And was it all worth it? Yes. Yes, it was. The Last Ninja was a massive, platform-defining hit. It sold millions of copies. One of the Commodore 64's crown jewels, this was a game that C64 owners truly could lord over everyone else, as you could only really play it here. The C64's major European competitors, the Amstrad CPC and ZX Spectrum, didn't get any kind of port of the game, with other ports mostly reserved for higher end machines like the Amiga and Atari ST. Not that ports for the likes of the Speccy weren't worked on, indeed a Speccy version was advertised, but the game was so big and so tough to port over that the effort to release it on the Speccy, as well as other platforms, ultimately just ran aground. Over all versions, the original Last Ninja is believed to have sold a stunning 4 million copies, with its Commodore 64 sales being enough to make it the most successful original game ever released onto the machine. Just what do you do in the game then? Well, you control the ninja Armakuni. He's the last one because the shogun Kotakuni killed all the others in his clan, and now he's out for revenge. He will battle enemies and solve puzzles in 6 levels of action and adventure set in feudal Japan. At first he starts out with only his fists and feet to take enemies on with, but soon Armakuni will have plenty of weapons at his disposal, everything from swords and nunchuckers to throwing stars and smoke bombs. As mentioned, there's also a lot of puzzling to be had, with items to be found and the like, and there's also plenty of precision. You're certainly going to have to do a lot of ninja type things to beat the game. The presentation of The Last Ninja was, and indeed remains, utterly amazing. It's still one of the best looking titles ever to be released on an 8-bit machine. The art is beautiful, and so is the music, courtesy of the excellent and, alas, both sadly departed team of Anthony Lees and Ben Daglish. How fun the game is to actually play these days for people can depend on a few things, I suppose. There are certain parts of The Last Ninja some might find a bit weird, like how Armakuni is a very respectful ninja who, despite all that surrounds him, will only ever walk on paths so as not to anger any samurai parkies who might be lurking around. This may be a bit odd for an adventure, but it was a limitation of the engine. Armakuni has to walk on the paths, otherwise the game wouldn't have been made. There simply wasn't enough memory for him to be able to walk on the grass. That's one of the game's weird quirks. Something that people may find more annoying is the incredibly precise to the point of pixel perfection jumping that Armakuni often has to do. This was John Twiddy's idea, as he felt that the game as designed was a bit too simple in parts. So you get these sections where Armakuni has to jump on stones or branches in various rivers and swamps that, if you get one even slightly, kill you outright. Mark Cale didn't necessarily agree with this, and the pair did have a few rows over the inclusion of these vicious swamps, but ultimately they went in, much to the distress of gamers everywhere. These are the only real frickin' annoying parts about the game. They're far, far too harsh and represent some of the toughest platforming challenges you will find in any game, but especially here when they're in a game that's not exactly suited to such things. These days you almost have to play the damned thing with a trainer, or perhaps even with save states on an emulator, just because of these parts. Lord knows how he had the patience for things like this back in the day, seriously. That aside, yeah, this game is still pretty good. A lot of this is down to how bloody wonderful it is to look at, especially for fans of the old 8-bit style. There's 6 levels, all of which are appreciably different, but it's still fun to get into some scraps and generally go around and be a ninja. Yes, it can be more than a little too precise in parts, and there may well be a lot of things about the game that would thwart someone trying to get into it now without having played it back in the day, but you can certainly see why this game was so loved by everyone, from magazines to gamers. It was the AAA blockbuster of its day, really, a game that drove the platform to its very outer limits. After such a brutal development cycle, System-3 were justifiably well rewarded by the game's success. They more than achieved what they initially set out to do. Following the success of the original, it would be up to the game's sequels to continue pushing things forward, while perhaps also refining the formula a little. And certainly in the case of The Last Ninja 2, Back with a Vengeance, System-3 did that while taking the story into some quite surprising directions. Thanks to Kotakuni creating a portal and shoving not just himself and his army, but also Armakuni through it, the setting has completely changed. We aren't in feudal Japan anymore, we're now in present-day New York. Naturally, this means there's now plenty more that can thwart our hero, such as cops who can gun him down with a single bullet, the various thugs that roam the street, and, of course, cars on the road. Armakuni's going to have to learn about the Green Cross Code pretty quickly if he's to stand any chance of sending the evil Shogun back to where he came from. The Last Ninja 2 is a pretty bloody good sequel indeed. The gameplay and the engine are much the same, but the gameplay has definitely been tightened up, with considerably less in the way of annoying pixel-perfect jumping sequences and the like, and more of having fun beating up enemies and taking on new challenges that reflect the fish-out-of-water modern world Armakuni finds himself in. And the music? Well, that's just even better this time around. Matt Gray did the soundtrack, and it might just be one of the very best on the C64 full stop, which is a pretty major thing to say. If someone hadn't played any of these games before, I would definitely tell them to start here. The Last Ninja 2 is definitely the most playable of the trio. It can still be kind of frustrating in parts, but the things that are frustrating are kind of par for the course with British microcomputer games of the time, in all honesty. And once again, it was another big old hit. Millions more copies sold here, and lots more love. It wasn't entirely without controversy, mind you. While there wasn't ever much of a hubbub around the game including ninjas, despite that word getting censored a fair bit here in the UK, System-3 saw fit to make a special edition of The Last Ninja 2 that not only featured the game, but also featured a ninja handbook, a ninja mask, and a rubber throwing star. That did cause a bit of a hullabaloo, so much so that Boots, a popular store for buying games along with your cosmetics and pills, took the game completely off of their shelves. This is one of those amusing things that naturally you would never get away with today. Sure, this Ninja Death Star may be made out of rubber, but it's still probably going to cause considerable damage to someone's eye, Butters style, if chucked around willy-nilly by impressionable children. This was also the first time a lot of other platforms really got a good taste of the series, such as the ZX Spectrum, which got a perfectly respectable port of the game coded by the ever-excellent Mev Dink. Weirdly, this game also ended up on the NES too, where it was simply known as The Last Ninja. This version isn't exactly bad or anything, although I don't think that NES fans particularly received it that well. Aside from the Wii Virtual Console versions of the Last Ninja games that came years later, this is the only port of a game in the series to a console. Finally, there was The Last Ninja 3, Real Hatred is Timeless, which as far as 8-bits go came out on the C64 only in 1991, with Amiga and Atari ST 16-bit versions following. We've had past settings, we've had present, so naturally this game ends up taking us to the future, as the battle between Armakuni and Kotakuni comes to an end beyond the stars. The game features a bit of a change in personnel. John Twiddy had by this point moved on from System-3, choosing to form a company of his own called Vivid Image with the aforementioned Mev Dink. Mind you, this is far from the end for John and System-3. He's frequently returned several times over the years, and seeing as Vivid were pretty close to System-3's officers, he'd still be somewhat around for this game's development. That said, his replacement was quality. Stan Shembri, previously a coder on the likes of Barbarian and Cauldron 2 for Palace Software, took the reins and chose to strike out on his own with a new engine as opposed to simply using what John Twiddy and Hugh Riley had already created. Said engine already had a run out the previous year on Shembri's first game for System-3, the rather intriguing Vendetta, which we'll get to later on. The end result may well be the least known and probably least treasured game in the series, but there's no doubt that, at least from a presentation standpoint, the game looks absolutely phenomenal, one of the most staggering works on the C64. The graphics have got even more of an upgrade, the soundtrack is phenomenal and very atmospheric, and the game even has a cinematic intro, something you almost never got on the Commodore. As for the gameplay, well, it's more of The Last Ninja, really. If you like those games, you'll like this. And if you don't like them, then this game isn't likely to change your mind about anything, because you already know the deal. Still, this was 1991, and the best thing that can be said about The Last Ninja 3 is that more than anything, it's a fond farewell from System-3 to the platform where they made their name. One last banger on the C64 before fully moving on to the 16-bit platforms. That's pretty much what The Last Ninja 3 is, in the end, and those who are still sticking with the system in the early 90s were pretty damn grateful for it. So there is the condensed story of what is System-3's signature series. They certainly had plenty of popular titles, but there is no doubt that The Last Ninja stands out from the rest of the pack as a phenomenal success in every regard. A title that absolutely put them amongst the premier players at the time. With The Last Ninja, System-3 completely showed that they were more than just brash talkers with a penchant for controversy, but that they absolutely could create highly ambitious and incredibly well-loved games indeed. we aren't quite done with The Last Ninja yet. There will be more to talk about as we have a look at the various failed attempts at bringing Armakuni back for another round. But for now, before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a look at some of System 3's other major titles from the 8-bit era. So just to finish off this first part of our look at the almighty System 3, we're going to try and round off their other 8-bit titles, which in the end should take us to about 1991. It's not like we're finished with big names either. There's some pretty major titles to have a look at in this lot too, which shows just how serious these guys were, especially on their much favoured Commodore 64. There were some other important behind-the-scenes things going on around this time too, in particular the end of System 3's relationship with the ailing Activision, but we're going to save that until the second part, so that we can focus on it a bit more. For now, let's take a look at some, for the most part, pretty damn fine games. First up, we've got Bangkok Nights from 1987. It's another beat-em-up. Not one that's as famous as International Karate, of course, but it's certainly one that's got a few fans. It's sort of a kickboxing game, inspired by a trip out to Thailand, and it is one that's quite well loved amongst C64 people. How so? Well, it's mainly about the looks. Bangkok Nights was one of the first fighting games to really feature sprites that were this big and this well defined. There weren't a lot of other games doing stuff like this, especially on computers like the Commodore. There's some very clever multiplexing of sprites going on under the hood to make the game look this smooth, and Hugh Riley and Nick Pellin deserve lots of credit for that. As a game, well, perhaps the actual fighting doesn't hold up quite as well nowadays, especially when compared to something like International Karate. You kinda just get right in there and bash the buttons. But you kind of have to get into the 1987 mindset with this one, and understand that at the time there weren't all that many games like Bangkok Nights around, and back then this was pretty freaking cutting edge. A very memorable game for some people, this one. Dominator from 1989 perhaps isn't quite as memorable. This is more of a regular space shooter, albeit one that has sections that are both vertical and horizontal. For the most part, it's a horizontal affair, kind of in a similar vein to Gradius or Salamander, particularly in the way it goes about giving you power-ups. It's not a bad shooter, although it has some quite familiar foibles that you often find in European shoot-em-ups, such as having a really frickin' big and slow ship with enemies that come at you fast and usually take multiple hits to kill. This game is pretty hard as a result. It's not a bad attempt at a shoot-em-up from System 3, and it is one of the only ones, but it kind of lacks refinement, and as a result of that, Dominator isn't usually mentioned amongst the C64's top shooters like, say, Armalite or Delta or Sanction. Okay, this next one is a pretty big deal. Not quite on the Last Ninja level, but not that far off. In 1989, System 3 released Myth: History in the Making, which proved to be one of the most loved and best received titles in the whole of System 3's catalogue. And for once, that love wasn't just limited to the C64. Myth, an action-adventure game where you take a thoroughly modern and seemingly quite normal boy back through time and pit him against many a familiar fantasy, was naturally originally built for the C64 with ports to come later, headed by Pete Barron and, as was usually the case, pushing the Commodore 64 pretty damn hard. The game was very much designed with the C64 in mind and pushed all of the platform's advantages to the fullest. But on the Spectrum, the team of Neil Dodwell and Dave Dew, previously responsible for visually impressive specky titles like Rex and Nemesis the Warlock, chose to, instead of directly porting Myth from the C64 version, almost create their own interpretation of the title that would be better suited to the specky. The end result is a title that's equally loved on both systems. In fact, the Spectrum version is often seen as the better of the two, even by Mark Cale himself. This was basically never the case for any other System 3 title in the 8-bit era. In both cases, you control a nameless teenage boy as he travels into the time of legends, various zones set in mythical settings such as Hades, ancient Greece, an Egyptian pyramid and the like. Ultimately, he must defeat Damuan, the Dark Angel of Time, in one-on-one combat if he is to return home. Myth's levels consist of a whole load of enemies to take on, but there's also quite a lot of puzzling to be had too. Often quite obtuse puzzling in fact, way more so than The Last Ninja. But there's a lot of platforming to be had as well. In many ways, Myth can be considered a proto-cinematic platformer. The C64 and Spectrum versions tend to play quite differently. The C64 naturally has scrolling, and you tend to do a lot more hand-to-hand fighting, whereas the Speccy version is a flick-screen game and you tend to do a lot more shooting. The C64 version is certainly very impressive indeed, in a way that absolutely meets high expectations, but on the Spectrum? My word. Myth is nothing short of a marvel. One of the most memorable of all the 128K games, the graphics are utterly outstanding. I'm not sure if I can think of too many better examples of sprite work on the system. There's so many huge, glorious examples, so much fluid movement. It is a special, special work. The final battle against Dameron, even if it is a strange shooter section that doesn't necessarily fit in with the rest of the game, it was knocked up in a day or two right at the end of production, is unbelievable looking, especially on here. In the end, Myth, in all of its 8-bit versions, shows off just what the 8-bit systems can do in good hands. The Amstrad version also warrants a mention, being another excellent port in much the same vein of the Speccy version. It's pretty definitively an 8-bit game too. It ended up taking quite a weird turn on the 16-bits. How so? Well, System-3 naturally tried to sell the game in America, and they succeeded, striking a deal with Mindscape. But Mindscape weren't feeling the whole normal teenage boy thing, so they stuck, of all things, Conan the Barbarian in it. And so we get Conan the Mysteries of Time, which ended up appearing on the NES in America, where it never got much of a good reception. Strangely enough, the Amiga port of the game, as well as the Atari ST port, which never ended up getting released, went more in the Conan direction as opposed to the direction of the original, and it's a much lesser game on the 16-bit systems because of it. And so the 8-bit micros are the only way to play this late gem, and seriously, it is utterly recommended that you do, especially the staggering achievement that is the Speccy version. Tusker, from 1989, is another System-3 arcade adventure, and it's one of the more obscure ones. In this title, everything goes a little bit Indiana Jones. You go through 3 stages of desert, caves and jungle, battling with various minions and evil spirits, on a mission to complete your dad's quest. Tusker is far from as well remembered as System-3's other efforts in the genre, and you know what, there's not much about it that sticks out an awful lot. Obviously the technical standard is still high, and the music's pretty good, no surprise there, but it doesn't play as well as most of the company's other efforts at this time. It would probably be a better game in the hands of another studio. For System-3, Tusker feels kind of derivative and generic. It's not a bad game at all, just not a memorable one. Moving a little bit away from the action adventures, we have a more arcadey game from System-3, the absolutely fantastic Flimbo's Quest, released in 1990. This game, an affair filled with production from guys who were in the demo scene such as Laurens van der Donk, didn't get a whole lot of love from the gaming press when it came out, but it seems to have held up quite well over time. The game is quite simple. You play as Flimbo, and you rescue your girlfriend from an evil professor with the help of a wizard. The wizard needs scrolls in order to help you out, and you collect them by getting them off specific enemies. The enemy in question will be flashing when you see it, and helpfully there's a display at the bottom that shows you the type of enemy you've got to kill. A lot of Flimbo's Quest is about quickly learning a level and figuring out where certain enemies spawn from. It gets harder over time as enemies appear in much tighter windows, or they could be a lot faster than you, thus requiring some sort of power-up. And the whole game is on a timer that always needs attention. You can always get 2 extra minutes from the wizard, but naturally you need money to do so. This isn't exactly the longest of games, there's only 7 levels in the whole thing, but what's here has the usual System-3 panache, in that it's strikingly well presented, and there's also some excellent music thanks to the Maniacs of Noise, in other words Jerome Tell. It's a nice little breeze of a game, and certainly quite different to a lot of the other System-3 titles that tended to be more gritty and dark. It is, I suppose, kind of a precursor perhaps to more famous games like Putty that we'll be seeing later on, and it's very enjoyable indeed. Check this one out if you've never played it. Here's a quicker one. Turbocharged is one of the last System-3 games for the C64, coming out as late as 1991. It's not one of their most famous ones, and that's not really surprising because, well, it's perhaps the most derivative title we've seen from them so far. You play as a pair of agents who get in their car and have to hunt down a bunch of terrorists in Iraq who are stealing missiles and generally causing mischief. You blast everyone that you see on the road with impunity. They're all criminals and they're all guilty. The crime is life and the sentence is death. This game looks fine and everything, of course, but the whole thing's just pretty I say that it's derivative because honestly, it feels a fair bit too similar to Chase HQ 2 or Special Criminal Investigation or whatever you want to call it. The same mix of driving and shooting, the same eventual goal of chasing down and gradually destroying a lead car. There's not a whole lot else to the game other than that, and in the end, alas, it's just a bit boring. While System-3 did a pretty good job in general of saying goodbye to the C64, sticking with their brand of original titles, they weren't entirely immune from the lesser games that often tend to define a studio's output at the end of a system's life. When you see the name Vendetta, you might cast your mind immediately to the famous IRM beat-em-up from the arcades. However, this is not that. Vendetta is another original System-3 work from 1990, and a game that takes place in a format that's quite familiar. Basically, it's the studio's other isometric action adventure, as previously seen of course in The Last Ninja. This game was developed, as mentioned, by the late Stan Schembri, and while it does look similar to The Last Ninja, it doesn't quite use the same engine. Schembri rewrote it a fair bit. The reworked engine, as used in this game, would then be used later on in The Last Ninja 3, also headed by Schembri. As another game in a style that had made System-3 a pretty considerable amount of money by this point, Vendetta was highly rated by the press at the time it came out, although it doesn't seem to be that remembered these days. In the game you're tasked with foiling another terrorist plot, and you play as a character who, well, kind of looks a little bit like Arnold Schwarzenegger, don't you think? There's a fair bit of punching and kicking, but there's also a lot of shooting. You pick up guns fairly quickly, and you're going to want to use them a lot of the time, especially on the multitude of enemies who unfairly also have guns at their disposal. Other than that, there's naturally items to grab and puzzles to solve, much like The Last Ninja. On the whole, it's okay. The game does have fans amongst those who do remember it, but I don't really jive with this one as much as I do with The Last Ninja games. It often kind of feels like a pain in the arse, with some pretty unfair sections that cast your mind all the way back to the original Last Ninja. It's important in that it obviously gave Schembri the grounding needed to then go in and make a perfectly good third and final Last Ninja game, but this first run through, doing something a little bit different, for me it just misses the mark. Curiously, there is almost a hint that the plan for Schembri was always to get him on that third Last Ninja game. How does Vendetta end? Well, it ends with a final standoff in, of all places, Central Park. Perhaps they're set in the same universe. A flawed title then, but certainly a curious one. Finally, to end on an incredibly high note, we have to look at the sequel to International Karate. Archer McLean originally took a flawed title and managed to beat it into completion. Now he has a sequel where he's completely in control. The result is the classic IK Plus from 1987, which you may know as Chop and Drop if you're American. The main inspiration for Archer was when Activision asked him about his thoughts on what he would like to see in a fighting game, and he said that he'd like to see the other fighters on the floor while you take on the next opponent. And from there suddenly, he had a eureka moment. A brilliant idea for a sequel to International Karate that he just knew was going to work. The main thing about IK Plus, of course, is that the number of fighters has increased from 2 to 3. Instead of a more traditional karate bout, you now have an incredibly fast-paced bout where these 3 fighters constantly attack each other. The fighting doesn't stop when someone gets knocked down, it only stops when the timer reaches 0 or one of the fighters reaches a certain amount of points. You, as the white player, simply have to survive and thrive. You continue on so long as you're not the last placed of the 3 whenever play stops. As with the original, play is broken up with minigames. Here there's 2, one where you deflect balls with a shield, and another where you kick away random bombs. These changes to the original formula quite simply make for a total classic, the best fighting game released before Street Fighter 2, as far as I'm concerned. Everything has been improved. Even if there is only one background, it's beautiful, evocative and filled with quite amusing Easter eggs. The animations are so much tighter now, painstakingly created and often cribbed from movies and the like. The backflip comes from Grease, for example, and the splits kick is from Jackie Chan in the Cannonball one. Rob Hubbard sticks one of his all-time best ever tunes into the game as well, just to really cement its quality. This is just a game that you can play over and over again, just to relax and get into the mode. Even when you lose, you can literally start all over again in a second. There's even some rather fun little cheat codes to play with, such as the one that removes the fighter's pants. It's wonderful. It deserved all the success, not to mention all the ports and all the updates of the game that took IK Plus into the 90s and even beyond. Even as fighting games continued to progress technically, there was still a definite appetite for this. It won't surprise anyone for me to say that IK Plus is, of all System-3's games, my personal favourite. I absolutely love it. Okay, with the end of System-3's fantastic run on the C64, we've reached a pretty good place to finish part 1. There's a lot more to talk about in part 2. As mentioned, there's the switch away from Activision. But there's also other things, such as a brilliant new IP that enjoyed several games, including an Amiga one that reached, legendary status of a sort. There's the reason that System-3 managed to survive in the 32-bit era when lots of other studios didn't. There's the story of how incredibly prolific they were in the PS2 days, and of course, we're going to wrap it all up with their legacy and their continued survival to this day. Hopefully you'll join me for the second part of this great company's story, but until then, as ever, I shall say bye for now. I'd just like to say thank you so much to my patrons. This video would not have been possible without them. I want to say a very special thank you to the almighty Ian Roberts, who put in a request to finally get this documentary about System-3 done. And I want to say, as ever to all of you, thank you for watching. If you liked the video, please do like it, leave your comments, and have a look at my social media, my Twitter, where you can find me doing lots of rubbish posting, and of course, my Patreon. I would also like to thank these following very awesome people: Alexa Jones-Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Andy Capt, Asobi Kwan DX, Brian Henniger, Chris, Cody Spooner, Conrad Pritchard, D. Zaliel Rimron Sutter, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dinty76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, Glunfef, Ian Roberts, James Brown, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Lucas Kuligovsky, Mateus Granzov, Martin Pataki, Potter Margel, Ren Bimon, Rusty Kelly, Samir Alamar, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tarek Amir, The Geeky Dad, Tim Wald, Yerka Operator, and to all the rest of the community, thank you so much, and goodbye.